I never told my son-in-law I was a retired Navy SEAL. He thought I was just a soft old father-in-law, until my daughter sent me her secret distress code. 15 minutes later, he learned exactly who he had invited into his home. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth, and make sure to listen to the very end, because what happens next will change the way you look at your own family forever. The dining room was suffocatingly warm that evening, thick with the smell of roasted garlic and the heavy unspoken tension that had been building for months. I sat at the polished oak table staring at the thick stack of legal documents Trent had just slid across the surface. Trent was a man who wore expensive suits to hide his lack of character. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass, and told me that signing over the deed to my house was a necessary step for my declining cognitive health. He spoke to me slowly, using that condescending, sugary tone people reserve for toddlers and the terminally confused. I looked at the documents, the stark black ink demanding the surrender of the home I had built with my own 2 hands, the home where I had raised my daughter, Rachel. I did not shout. I did not throw the wine in his arrogant face. Instead, I channeled every ounce of discipline I possessed to play the exact role he had assigned to me. I let my shoulders slump. I reached for the pen deliberately, allowing my hand to tremble so violently that the pen clattered against my porcelain dinner plate. I lowered my eyes and murmured that I was just so tired that my vision was blurry and that I needed a few days to read the fine print. The fake frailty worked, but it triggered something ugly in Trent. His mask of fake concern evaporated instantly. He slammed his fist onto the heavy oak table with such sudden violence that the silverware jumped and clattered. He leaned across the table, getting uncomfortably close to Rachel, and hissed a venomous threat directly into her ear, telling her to fix her useless father, or else there would be hell to pay tonight. Rachel did not argue. She shrank back into her chair, her shoulders hunching inward. She looked across the table at me, and in her eyes I saw sheer paralyzing terror. It was the look of a hostage. In that single fleeting glance, the entire illusion of their happy suburban marriage shattered into dust. I knew right then that my daughter was living in a nightmare, and the man sitting across from me was the monster keeping her there. Trent did not handle my delay well. Within the hour, his frustration mutated into outright hostility. He cornered me in the hallway, demanding my wallet, and coldly informed me that he had already cut off my access to my own bank accounts. He claimed he had filed a preliminary guardianship petition with the courts, effectively making me a ward of his household. Before I could process the legal implications, he gripped my upper arm with a bruising force and marched me down the narrow stairs to the basement guest room. He shoved me inside, claiming it was for my own safety, until I came to my senses and signed the deed. The heavy door slammed shut, followed by the distinct electronic beep of a high-security keypad lock engaging from the outside. I stood in the pitch-black basement listening to his heavy footsteps retreat upstairs. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury that gets people killed, a lesson drilled into me decades ago. I took a slow, deep breath, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. I needed to assess the situation. I began rummaging through the meager furnishings of the guest room. I stripped a thin piece of mounting wire from the back of a cheap landscape painting hanging on the wall. I found a sturdy metal paperclip abandoned inside the drawer of a dusty nightstand. The skills I had relied on during covert deployments in the Middle East had not degraded with age. Muscle memory took over my fingers, reading the subtle clicks and tension of the internal mechanisms. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass the lock entirely. The door swung open silently. I crept up the basement stairs, placing my weight on the extreme edges of the wooden treads to prevent any creaking. A faint, trembling sound drew me toward the kitchen. I found Rachel sitting on the cold linoleum floor, her back pressed hard against the cabinets. She was sobbing silently into her hands. When she looked up, the refrigerator light illuminated her face, and my heart stopped. She was clutching her left arm, and beneath the torn fabric of her sleeve, I saw dark, ugly bruises blooming across her pale skin. The sight of my little girl hurt like that ignited a cold, calculated fury deep inside my chest. I crouched beside her, whispering that we were leaving right now. But she shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with a desperate panic. She refused to leave. She told me that Trent would hunt them down, that he would use his money and lawyers to take full custody of her son, little Leo, and that he would hurt the boy just to punish her. She was a prisoner to her own maternal instinct. Looking at her bruised arm and hearing the utter defeat in her voice, I realized a simple escape was no longer a viable option. Running would only delay the inevitable. I realized I could not just take her away. I had to completely and utterly dismantle Trent's world until there was nothing left for him to fight with. Before I could formulate a concrete plan, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the top of the main staircase. Trent was awake. Rachel gasped, her face draining of color, and shoved me desperately toward the basement door. But I was not fast enough. Trent rounded the corner into the kitchen, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage when he saw me standing outside of my designated prison. He lunged forward, grabbing the collar of my shirt and slamming me hard against the drywall. He pressed his face close to mine, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cheap cruelty. He threatened to call the police right that second. He told me he would claim I was a violent, hallucinating dementia patient who had attacked him in the middle of the night, and that the authorities would lock me away in a state psychiatric ward where I would rot for the rest of my days. He dragged me roughly back down the basement stairs, shoving me so forcefully that I stumbled and fell to my knees on the cold concrete. He reached into my pocket, ripping my smartphone away, laughing a cold, hollow laugh as he locked the heavy door once again. He left me in the dark with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and the old analog watch ticking steadily on my wrist. He genuinely believed he had completely isolated me, stripping away my ability to call for help. He felt like a god in his own house. But Trent was an arrogant civilian. He did not know about the heavy winter coat hanging forgotten in the back of the musty basement closet. He did not know about the thick insulated lining or the small incision I had carefully sewn shut 5 years ago. I sat in the darkness, watching the luminous green hands of my watch slowly sweep across the dial. The silence of the basement was heavy, suffocating, but my mind was racing through tactical scenarios. Then, at exactly 2:14 in the morning, a faint rhythmic vibration broke the absolute stillness. I moved silently to the closet, ripped open the hidden seam in the coat, and pulled out a modified encrypted pager. It was a relic from my active duty days, running on a highly secure, untraceable frequency. I stared at the small green screen glowing in the pitch-black room. A sequence of numbers flashed rapidly across the display. 10, 4, 10, 4, 33. My breath caught in my throat. It was the secret military distress code I had taught Rachel when she was just 10 years old. Back when I was deploying to active combat zones, I wanted her to have an unbreakable lifeline to me if things ever went wrong at home. She had remembered it all these years. She had found a way to use it tonight. The code had a very specific, undeniable meaning in our household. Imminent danger. Lethal force authorized. The moment I saw those numbers glow on the tiny screen, the frail grandfather vanished, and the seasoned operative reawakened. Time was ticking. I had exactly 15 minutes to neutralize the immediate physical threat to my daughter without triggering a police response that Trent could manipulate with his lies and his lawyers. I approached the basement door. I bypassed the lock a second time, my hands moving with lethal efficiency. I stepped out into the hallway. The home security system panel glowed a steady warning red on the wall. It was fully armed, ready to alert the authorities the second a door opened or a motion sensor was tripped. I slid the plastic casing off the panel. Using a small piece of copper wire I had stripped from a broken lamp in the basement, I quickly cross-wired the primary circuit board. I bypassed the entire alarm system in 12 seconds flat, without triggering the tamper switch. The house remained dead silent, but to me, it was an active combat zone. I moved up the main staircase, hugging the walls to avoid the creaking floorboards, my breathing controlled and silent. I reached the master bedroom. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open just enough to slip inside without making a sound. The moonlight filtered through the heavy blinds, casting long shadows over the nightmare unfolding inside. Trent was standing by the edge of the bed, towering over Rachel. His face was contorted with blind fury, and his hand was raised high, curled into a tight fist, preparing to strike her across the face. He never even heard me breathe. I closed the distance in 3 silent, explosive strides. I did not shout a warning. I grabbed his raised arm, twisting it sharply behind his back, until the joint popped, while simultaneously kicking the back of his knee to sweep his leg out from under him. He hit the carpeted floor hard, the breath violently knocked out of his lungs. Before he could even register the pain or attempt to scream, I dropped my full weight onto his spine, pinning him face down with a silent, paralyzing submission hold. My hand clamped over his mouth and nose, completely cutting off his ability to make a sound. With my free hand, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy-duty tactical zip ties I had retrieved from my old deployment gear bag in the basement. In seconds, I had his wrists bound tightly behind his back, the plastic cutting deep into his skin. I glanced at the luminous face of my analog watch. It was 2:27 a.m. 13 minutes had passed since Rachel's distress code reached me. I released his mouth just enough to let him gasp for air. Trent lay on the floor, panting helplessly, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated shock. He stared up at the frail old man he thought he had conquered, finally realizing he was looking into the cold, dead eyes of a trained killer. I did not explain myself. I did not utter a single word to him. I stood up calmly, walked over to his nightstand, and took his encrypted laptop and his smartphone. I grabbed him by his collar, dragged his bound body into the master bathroom, tossed him onto the cold tile floor, and locked the door from the outside. I turned back to look at Rachel. She was shaking uncontrollably, staring at me in a mixture of awe, relief, and exhaustion. The immediate physical threat was contained for tonight. But as I looked down at the stolen laptop in my hands, I knew the real war had only just begun. I stepped out of the master bedroom and quietly pulled the heavy wooden door shut until the latch clicked. The muffled thumps echoing from the ensuite bathroom told me Trent was conscious and furiously struggling against the tactical zip ties. He would not be breaking free tonight. The plastic binding was designed to restrain enemy combatants and not suburban corporate managers. I walked silently down the carpeted hallway toward the guest room where Rachel was holding my grandson. Leo was 5 years old and rubbing his tired eyes in the dim light. He asked in a small voice why we were awake so late. I gave him a gentle smile and told him we were going on a surprise midnight camping trip. Rachel looked at me with 1,000 frantic questions swirling in her tear-filled eyes. But when she saw the cold determination etched into my face, she simply nodded. She grabbed a small canvas duffel bag and packed a few days' worth of clothes in complete silence. I led them down the back staircase and out through the heavy kitchen door leading to my detached garage. The cool night air hit my face, and it was a sharp, welcome contrast to the suffocating tension that had poisoned the inside of that house. I opened the side door of the garage and guided my daughter and grandson into the cab of my old heavy-duty truck. I told Rachel to lock the doors and keep her head down below the dashboard. Before I climbed into the driver's seat, I walked over to the solid oak workbench at the back of the garage. I reached underneath the bottom shelf and ran my hand along the rough, untreated wood until my fingers brushed against a hidden false panel. I pulled the panel loose and retrieved a heavy shock-proof metallic case. Inside rested a military-grade decryption drive. It was officially obsolete by modern government standards, but it was more than capable of tearing through civilian encryption protocols. I tossed the heavy case into the passenger seat and turned the ignition and pulled out of the driveway without turning on the headlights until we were 3 blocks away. I drove us out of the affluent, manicured suburban neighborhood and headed straight toward the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. I knew a rundown motel right off the interstate that did not ask unnecessary questions and only accepted cash. The flickering neon sign cast a sickly yellow glow over the cracked asphalt parking lot. It was exactly the kind of forgotten place Trent and his country club friends pretended did not exist. I paid the tired clerk for a room at the very back of the property furthest from the main road and entirely hidden from the street. Inside the room, the stale air smelled faintly of cheap bleach and old cigarette smoke. I immediately checked the window locks and pulled the heavy blackout curtains completely shut. Rachel tucked Leo into one of the double beds. Within minutes, the sheer exhaustion of the traumatic night pulled the boy into a deep, dreamless sleep. Rachel sat on the very edge of the second bed and wrapped her arms tightly around her knees. She finally looked up at me and asked what I had done to her husband. I looked at my only daughter and saw the faint, ugly outline of the bruises blooming on her arm, and I told her the absolute truth. I told her I had neutralized the immediate threat, but that we were now operating on a very strict and dangerous timeline. Trent would eventually break free, or someone would hear his muffled shouting. I needed to know exactly what kind of enemy we were dealing with before he could alert his network. I sat down at the small, wobbly laminate table in the corner of the motel room. I pulled Trent's sleek silver laptop from my canvas bag and set it down on the scratched surface. It was password protected, and the hard drive was fully encrypted. For a man who wore expensive tailored suits and projected an image of total control, he was remarkably careless with his digital security. I opened the metallic case I had retrieved from the garage and pulled out the decryption drive. The device was bulky and heavy and connected by a thick, reinforced cable. I plugged it into the side port of the laptop and rapidly typed in a sequence of bypass commands I had memorized over 2 decades ago during counter-terrorism deployments. The laptop screen flickered black and then suddenly flooded with cascading lines of white code as the military drive brute forced its way through Trent's civilian firewall. I sat there in the dim yellow light of the motel room, listening to the rhythmic, anxious hum of the laptop cooling fan. I watched the green progress bar inch forward across the screen. It was a silent race against time. Every single minute that ticked by was another minute Trent was thrashing on that bathroom floor, plotting his violent retaliation. I knew exactly how men like him operated. They did not accept defeat gracefully. They escalated. I needed to find the center of gravity in his life and find the exact pressure point I could strike to bring his entire carefully constructed world collapsing down around him. The laptop chimed softly. The screen flashed a brilliant blue, and the main desktop finally appeared. I was completely in. I began systematically combing through his personal files and hidden directories. I ignored his generic corporate work presentations and his mundane daily email correspondence. I was looking for the hidden, dirty architecture of his life. Men who are arrogant enough to physically assault their wives always keep meticulous records of their own arrogance. They simply cannot help themselves. Deep inside a nested password-protected folder, falsely labeled with a mundane tax year, I found a hidden subdirectory. It was simply titled Retirement. I clicked on it fully, expecting to find evidence of hidden offshore bank accounts or illicit investments or funds he was actively hiding from Rachel. What I actually found was infinitely more sinister and terrifying. There were no financial spreadsheets in that folder. There were high-resolution scanned documents bearing the official embossed letterhead of a prominent local medical clinic. I clicked on the first file and began to read. It was a highly detailed, comprehensive neurological evaluation. My full name was printed clearly at the very top of the page. The document detailed a tragic, rapid, and aggressive cognitive decline. It falsely described me as suffering from severe late-stage dementia. It fabricated stories claiming I was highly prone to violent physical outbursts and profound memory loss and severe unmanageable paranoia. I stared at the glowing screen with the blood running absolutely ice cold in my veins. I scrolled down to the second document in the folder. It was a legally binding sworn affidavit, fully prepared and ready to be filed with the state family court. It petitioned for my immediate involuntary commitment to a secure psychiatric facility. Even worse, the document granted Trent full and permanent power of attorney over my entire estate and my financial assets and all of my future medical decisions. At the very bottom of the medical evaluation was a sprawling signature belonging to a man named Dr. Elliot Sterling. I did not know who this particular doctor was, but looking at his signature, validating a completely fabricated medical diagnosis, I knew exactly what kind of man he was. He was a corrupt, unethical physician on Trent's payroll and a man perfectly willing to declare a completely sane, healthy man legally insane for the right amount of cash. Trent had not just wanted the deed to my house. He had methodically and coldly planned to completely erase my existence. He was going to have me dragged out of my own home in a straitjacket and locked permanently inside a padded room and heavily doped up on antipsychotic medications until I actually did lose my mind. He was going to silence me permanently so he could easily control Rachel and drain every last cent of my life savings without anyone asking a single question. I slowly closed the laptop screen. I looked across the dim motel room at Rachel, who had finally fallen asleep, holding her young son tightly against her chest. Trent had planned to throw me in a cage and leave her completely defenseless to his abuse. He truly thought he was playing a simple game of chess against a fragile, forgetful old man. He had absolutely no idea he had just declared war on a man who had spent his entire adult life hunting and destroying monsters far worse than him. I opened the laptop screen again, letting the harsh glare illuminate the cheap motel room. I had already discovered the what and the how of Trent's plan, but I still needed the why. Men like my son-in-law were naturally greedy, but orchestrating a multi-layered medical fraud to lock away a relative required a very specific kind of desperation. I dug much deeper into the machine. I bypassed his local storage folders entirely and accessed his cloud backups and hidden encrypted messenger histories. It did not take long for the grand illusion of the successful suburban corporate manager to completely evaporate before my eyes. Trent was bleeding cash at an astonishing rate. His legitimate bank accounts were hovering dangerously close to zero, masked only by a dizzying shell game of transferring minimum payments between maxed-out high-yield credit cards. He drove a luxury imported sedan and wore custom-tailored suits, but his net worth was an absolute fiction. But the real catastrophic damage was hidden in a secondary offshore account profile that I had to pry open using a brute force script. Trent was not just living beyond his comfortable means. He was a severe high-stakes gambling addict. I sat in the quiet dark sifting through thousands of digital transaction logs. There were endless wire transfers to offshore sports betting platforms, illicit digital casinos, and unregulated underground poker ledgers. I watched the timestamps of the wagers getting closer and closer together, painting a pathetic picture of a man frantically chasing his losses into oblivion. I pulled up a digital calculator on the screen and started tallying the running deficit. The final numbers were absolutely staggering. Trent was over $500,000 in the red. And the truly terrifying part was that he did not owe this massive sum of money to a reputable banking institution. A bank would simply garnish his corporate wages or repossess his luxury cars and put a lien on his home. He owed $500,000 to a shadow syndicate. I read through the buried communication logs between Trent and his creditors. The men he was dealing with did not send polite collection letters in the mail. They sent covert photographs of the front doors of their debtors. They sent pictures of their targets' children getting off the school bus in the afternoon. They were violent, unyielding predators who dealt exclusively in fear and physical consequence. This was the absolute catalyst for the nightmare he had brought into my home. This was why he needed the deed to my house and access to my military pension so urgently. He was a completely cornered rat. My property was entirely paid off and sitting on a highly desirable plot of land in a wealthy neighborhood. If he had me successfully declared legally insane and secured the permanent power of attorney, he could liquidate my family home in a matter of weeks and use my life savings to save his own skin. But as I sat there looking at the sleeping figures of my daughter and grandson, I realized there was a massive missing piece to his puzzle. Rachel. My daughter was a brilliant, highly capable woman. She loved me fiercely. She would never simply stand by and allow him to sell her childhood home without launching a massive, very public legal battle. She would immediately scrutinize every single financial transaction if she knew I was locked away in a ward. Trent knew this perfectly well. He knew Rachel was a massive liability to his survival. I navigated away from the financial ledgers and moved into his deleted email drafts folder. It was a digital graveyard of his most poisonous and manipulative thoughts. I found a long-saved email thread communicating with a notoriously sleazy family law attorney known for dragging out brutal custody battles. Trent had been carefully and methodically laying the groundwork to completely destroy Rachel for over a year. He had been secretly documenting her supposed emotional instability. He was intentionally taking her frustrated text messages completely out of context. He had been secretly audio recording her crying in the kitchen after he had subjected her to hours of silent verbal abuse. I was building a massive fabricated narrative to present to a judge claiming that Rachel was an unfit, hysterical mother suffering from severe, unmanageable clinical depression. His ultimate endgame was sickeningly clear. He was going to blindside her with a vicious divorce filing. He would use his fabricated evidence of her mental instability to secure full and sole custody of little Leo. I was even petitioning to have Rachel legally mandated to an inpatient psychiatric facility for her own supposed well-being. With me locked away to rot in a dementia ward, and Rachel committed against her will for mental instability, Trent would be the sole legal guardian of my grandson and the undisputed executor of all our family assets. He would pay off the violent gambling syndicate with my life savings, keep his pristine corporate facade completely intact, and leave my daughter and me to die in institutional cages. The sheer scale of his sociopathy was breathtaking. He viewed his own family as nothing more than disposable, sacrificial collateral. I was willing to destroy the minds and lives of the people who loved him just to cover up his own pathetic weaknesses. I sat back in the wobbly motel chair and rubbed my tired eyes. The hot, explosive anger I had felt back in the house had completely vanished. It had cooled and hardened into something much more dangerous. It was the precise surgical focus I used to rely on when tracking high-value targets across hostile borders in the dark. Trent Lawson was no longer just a terrible, abusive husband to my daughter. He was an active, existential threat to my bloodline, and he needed to be entirely eradicated. Suddenly, a sharp, dissonant electronic chime broke the heavy silence of the motel room. A small notification banner slid across the top right corner of the laptop screen, casting a pale blue glow over the table. Trent had a hidden desktop application running silently in the background. It was a secure, peer-to-peer messaging client designed to leave zero digital footprint on a standard server. Because my decryption drive was currently mirroring his active session credentials, the incoming message bypassed his phone and populated directly on my screen. I hovered the cursor over the banner and clicked it open. The chat window expanded. The sender had no name, just an anonymous string of random alphanumeric characters. The message was short, devoid of any pleasantries, and terrifyingly clear. It read, "Time is up, Trent. 48 hours to deliver the first 100 grand. If the drop is empty on Friday night, we do not call again. We visit the wife. We visit the kid. Do not make us visit the kid." I read the message 3 times to ensure every single word was burned permanently into my memory. Trent was entirely out of time. The syndicate was officially calling in his massive debts, and they were actively, explicitly threatening Rachel and Leo. This meant that the man waking up on the cold bathroom floor of my house right now was not just angry and humiliated. He was desperate, cornered, and entirely out of rational options. And a desperate man with absolutely nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of enemy you can ever face. I closed the laptop and looked toward the heavily curtained window. Dawn was approaching, and the real war was about to begin. The cheap digital clock on the motel nightstand flipped to 6 in the morning. Pale sunlight began to bleed through the edges of the heavy blackout curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. I sat in the stiff wooden chair with my eyes burning from staring at the laptop screen all night. The message from the loan sharks hung over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Trent was out of time, which meant he was going to accelerate his timeline to survive. I navigated back to his sent email folder and refreshed the mail server. A new encrypted message popped up at the very top of the list. It was sent to Dr. Elliot Sterling just 10 minutes prior. It contained a single frantic sentence demanding the corrupt physician pull the trigger immediately. I opened the local county court portal using Trent's saved login credentials. There it was in plain black and white. An official medical order for involuntary psychiatric commitment had just been filed and stamped by the state magistrate. Trent and his doctor had formally and legally declared me an immediate threat to myself and others. According to the state law, I was no longer a citizen with constitutional rights. I was a fugitive patient. My first instinct, honed by years of survival in hostile territories, was to disappear completely. I could pack Rachel and Leo into the truck, drain my legitimate accounts of cash, and drive north until we hit the Canadian border. I had the skills to keep us hidden indefinitely. But running was exactly what Trent needed me to do. If I ran, I became the confused, wandering, paranoid dementia patient he had perfectly described in his fake medical files. Running would only validate his vicious lies and give him the undisputed legal high ground to step in and drain my estate in my absence. I needed to stand my ground and fight him in the light of day with undeniable, irrefutable medical evidence. I quietly walked over to the bed and woke Rachel. I told her to keep the motel door deadbolted and the chain locked. I instructed her not to open the door for anyone under any circumstances, not even the housekeeping staff. I promised her I would be back before noon. I stepped out into the crisp morning air and drove my truck straight toward the Regional Veterans Affairs Medical Center located downtown. The city was just beginning to wake up as I drove down the interstate. Commuters were sipping their morning coffee and listening to the radio, completely unaware of the invisible wars being fought right next to them. The Veterans Affairs Hospital was a massive, sprawling complex of red brick and reinforced glass. It was a place I knew intimately well. I parked the truck and walked through the sliding double doors, bypassing the crowded main waiting room filled with tired men and women waiting for their standard checkups. The smell of strong antiseptic and bitter cafeteria coffee filled my lungs. I went straight to the neurology department on the 4th floor. I did not ask the receptionist for a standard appointment. I bypassed the front desk entirely and approached the head administrator. She was a sharp, fiercely protective woman named Sarah, who had helped me navigate my complex retirement benefits a decade ago. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I was the active victim of a massive, fraudulent medical conspiracy. I told her someone was trying to steal my life, and I needed an emergency comprehensive cognitive evaluation panel right this very second. Sarah saw the absolute deadly gravity in my face. She did not ask me to fill out intake forms or wait in the lobby. Within the hour, I was sitting in a brightly lit, sterile examination room facing 3 board-certified neurologists. I spent the next 3 hours undergoing the most grueling mental and physical assessments they could legally administer to a human being. They did not take my word for anything. They hooked me up to functional magnetic resonance imaging machines to map the exact physical structure and blood flow of my brain. They peppered me with incredibly complex memory recall tests designed to trip up even the sharpest minds. They subjected me to advanced spatial reasoning puzzles and high-stress psychological evaluations meant to expose any hidden paranoia or latent aggression. I sat in that cold room and answered every single question with the cold, calculated precision of a military operative. I recited long, complex sequences of numbers completely backwards. I detailed my exact daily routines down to the minute. I calmly and thoroughly explained the highly intricate mechanical processes of disarming improvised explosive ordnance, a skill that requires absolute flawless cognitive retention and nerves of solid steel. I did not show an ounce of fatigue. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mind was an impenetrable fortress. The lead neurologist was a serious, highly decorated medical professional with graying hair and thick, round glasses. He finally set his heavy clipboard down on the stainless steel examination table. He took off his glasses and looked at me with a mixture of profound professional respect and deep personal concern. He told me that my brain was not just healthy for a 70-year-old man. He stated clearly that my cognitive function, my memory retention, and my psychological stress response levels were functioning in the top 1 percentile of the entire human population. He officially and formally certified that I showed absolutely zero signs of dementia or Alzheimer's disease or any other degenerative neurological condition. I asked all 3 doctors to sign and stamp the official evaluation. I demanded they bring the hospital notary into the room to seal the documents on the spot, making them completely legally binding in any court of law. I held the thick manila envelope in my calloused hands. It was my armor. It was the ultimate impenetrable shield against Trent's entire fabricated reality. As I walked out of the examination room and headed toward the hospital elevator, my secured burner phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I had synced it to the active email session on Trent's laptop before leaving the motel room to ensure I did not miss a single move he made. I opened the screen and read the newly intercepted message. It was an automated status update from Dr. Sterling's private medical transport company. The blood instantly drained from my face and my grip tightened around the phone. The medical order had not just been filed with the county courts. It had been officially and aggressively executed. Sterling had dispatched a specialized involuntary psychiatric transport team to my home address. The intercepted email detailed their strict and brutal protocol. They were not sending an ambulance with friendly nurses. They were sending a team of large, heavily built orderlies equipped with chemical sedatives and heavy canvas straitjackets. The transport team had been explicitly briefed that their target was a highly violent, physically unpredictable military veteran suffering from severe paranoid delusions. They were legally authorized and instructed to use whatever physical force was necessary to subdue me and transport me directly to the locked high-security ward of the state psychiatric facility. Once inside those locked doors, it would take months of legal battles to get me out. The message ended with a live GPS tracking link. The transport team was exactly 10 minutes away from my house. They were walking into an empty home, but they would immediately alert Trent the second they found the basement door completely broken and his bound body locked in the master bathroom. My cover was about to be blown wide open. The quiet intelligence-gathering phase of this war was officially over. I had the medical proof I needed, but the enemy was mobilizing faster than I anticipated. I walked out of the hospital into the bright morning sun, knowing I had to strike Trent's foundation before he could leverage the police against me. I walked to my truck with the thick envelope tucked securely under my arm. The morning sun was bright and blinding. The digital clock on the dashboard read 7:15. The medical transport team was exactly 9 minutes away from my front door. If I drove back to my house now, I would be walking directly into a physical confrontation with 4 heavily built orderlies who were legally authorized to sedate me. I would not lose the physical fight, but a brawl on my front lawn would result in police involvement. Trent would use the police report to validate his fabricated story about my violent paranoia. I needed a completely different kind of weapon to neutralize this specific threat. I needed overwhelming legal artillery. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the secured burner phone. I dialed a specific local number I had memorized over 30 years ago. I listened to the line ring twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. The man on the other end of the line was Oliver Stanton. Oliver and I had served together in the Gulf during the early 90s. He was a brilliant, highly decorated naval intelligence officer who analyzed threat networks and dismantled enemy communications. After he retired his commission, he went to law school. Today, Oliver is the most feared and ruthless corporate litigator on the entire eastern seaboard. He builds legal fortresses for his clients and utterly destroys anyone who attempts to breach them. I did not say hello. I simply spoke my old military call sign into the receiver. The silence on the line was immediate and heavy. Oliver knew that I had not used that name in 2 decades. He knew instantly that my family was in critical danger. I quickly briefed him on the tactical situation. I explained exactly what Trent Lawson had done. I told him about the massive gambling debts, the violent loan shark syndicate, and the fraudulent medical evaluation signed by Dr. Elliot Sterling. I told him that an involuntary psychiatric transport team was currently rolling toward my property with orders to place me in a canvas straitjacket. Oliver did not waste a single second asking how I felt or offering empty sympathies. He asked for the specific name of the county magistrate who had stamped the order. He asked for the name of the private transport company. I opened my encrypted email application and forwarded him the completely flawless neurological evaluation I had just received from the 3 board-certified doctors at the veteran hospital. I also sent him the intercepted dispatch logs from Trent's computer. Oliver told me to stay completely away from my neighborhood. He warned me that if those orderlies laid eyes on me, they would execute the state order and inject me with heavy chemical sedatives before he could stop them. He told me to sit tight and watch the show. He was mobilizing his entire firm. I parked my truck in the empty lot of a quiet diner, about 2 miles away from my suburban neighborhood. I opened Trent's stolen laptop and accessed the hidden security cameras I had covertly installed around the exterior of my property 5 years ago. I watched the live high-definition video feed, illuminating the screen. At exactly 7:24, a plain, unmarked white transit van pulled directly into my driveway. The side doors slid open. 4 massive men wearing dark blue medical scrubs stepped out onto the concrete. 2 of them carried heavy medical bags, presumably filled with liquid sedatives. The other 2 carried thick canvas restraint jackets. They walked up my front walkway with the casual, arrogant confidence of men who were used to dragging terrified, defenseless people out of their own homes. They reached the front porch, and the lead orderly raised his heavy fist to pound on my front door. Before his knuckles could even touch the wood, a sleek black town car swerved aggressively into my driveway. The car parked horizontally, completely blocking the white transit van from leaving. The driver's side door opened, and Oliver Stanton stepped out into the morning light. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit and a dark crimson tie. He did not look like a friendly neighborhood attorney. He looked like an apex predator circling wounded prey. He held a thick stack of manila folders in his left hand. I watched the silent video feed as Oliver walked directly up the front steps and physically intercepted the lead orderly. The large man in the blue scrubs tried to push past him, but Oliver did not yield a single inch. He stood his ground and shoved a freshly stamped legal document directly into the chest of the medical transport leader. I could not hear the audio, but I knew exactly what Oliver was saying. He was informing them that the county psychiatric commitment order had just been officially suspended by an emergency federal injunction. He was explaining that their authorizing physician, Dr. Elliot Sterling, was currently the primary target of an active federal investigation for gross medical fraud and document forgery. Oliver pointed a steady, accusing finger directly at the unmarked white van. He was calmly warning the orderlies that if they attempted to enter my property or lay a single finger on my person, they would not be acting as medical professionals. They would be acting as criminal accomplices to a federal kidnapping conspiracy. The orderlies were highly paid mercenaries, but they were not fools. They looked down at the federal seals stamped in heavy red ink across the documents. They looked back at the ruthless corporate lawyer staring them down with absolutely zero hesitation. The lead orderly raised his hands in a gesture of immediate surrender. He signaled to his team. The four massive men turned around, packed their heavy canvas restraints back into their bags, and practically ran back to their transit van. They backed recklessly over my front lawn to get around Oliver's town car and sped away down the quiet suburban street. The immediate threat of physical commitment was completely neutralized, but Oliver was not finished. He turned away from the street and used the emergency keypad code I had provided him to unlock my front door. I switched the camera feed to the interior hallway monitor. Oliver walked straight past the kitchen and headed directly toward the master bathroom, where I had left Trent securely bound, with tactical zip ties. Oliver unlatched the heavy deadbolt and pushed the bathroom door wide open. Trent scrambled out of the darkness. His expensive dress shirt was torn, and his face was purple with blind, absolute rage. His wrists were bleeding slightly from furiously fighting against the thick plastic restraints all night long. He stumbled into the hallway, expecting to see the team of medical orderlies he had paid to haul me away. Instead, he found a towering corporate litigator standing calmly in his hallway, holding a personalized legal subpoena. Trent froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden, unexpected presence of a stranger in his home. Oliver did not offer to cut the zip ties binding Trent's hands. He simply dropped the thick legal folder directly onto the hardwood floor at Trent's feet. He informed my son-in-law that his fraudulent medical petition had been entirely obliterated. He formally served Trent with a notice of active federal investigation regarding his financial coercion and his illicit conspiracy with Dr. Sterling. I watched the live video feed as the remaining color completely drained from Trent's face. The arrogant, confident mask he wore every single day shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked down at the legal documents resting by his feet, and he finally realized that his foolproof, brilliant plan to dispose of me had failed catastrophically. He was completely out of money. He was entirely stripped of his physical leverage, and the violent loan shark syndicate was still demanding $500,000 by tomorrow night. I closed the laptop screen. I knew that stripping a desperate man of his legal avenues would force him to take extreme, reckless criminal measures to survive. Trent was about to make a fatal mistake, and I was going to be waiting in the shadows when he did. The truck engine idled smoothly as I merged onto the highway, leaving the quiet suburban streets in my rearview mirror. The physical confrontation at my house was over, and the threat of the medical transport team had been neutralized, but the most critical phase of the operation was just beginning. Trent was backed into a corner, stripped of his fraudulent medical authority and isolated from his hired muscle. I knew from decades of hunting desperate men across the globe that his next move would be a frantic scramble for resources. He still owed a violent gambling syndicate $500,000, and his first installment of $100,000 was due by tomorrow night. He could no longer sell my house or access my military pension to save his own skin. That meant he was going to turn to the only remaining source of liquidity he could get his hands on. He was going to drain Rachel dry. I drove directly into the heart of the financial district, navigating the heavy morning traffic with practiced patience. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the towering glass skyscraper that housed Oliver Stanton and his army of corporate litigators. I took the private elevator up to the 35th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a massive reception area paneled in dark mahogany and polished steel. Oliver was already waiting for me. In his corner office, staring out at the city skyline with a cold, predatory satisfaction. He had returned from my house less than 20 minutes ago, having left Trent completely paralyzed by the sudden delivery of federal subpoenas. But Oliver was not celebrating. He pointed to a large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall of his office. He had a team of forensic accountants tracking the digital footprint of Trent and Rachel's joint financial accounts in real time. Oliver turned to me and stated that Trent was currently logging into the primary banking portal from a mobile IP address. He was actively attempting to initiate a massive domestic wire transfer. He was trying to move $85,000 directly from Rachel's joint savings account into a completely untraceable offshore holding account. That money was everything Rachel had saved from her decade of working as a graphic designer. It included the college fund she had painstakingly built for my grandson Leo. Trent was casually attempting to steal his own child's future just to buy himself a few more days of breathing room from the loan sharks. I pulled my secured burner phone from my pocket and dialed the number for the safe motel where Rachel and Leo were hiding. Rachel answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. I did not sugarcoat the situation. I told her exactly what her husband was attempting to do at this very second. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a profound, heartbreaking silence. For a brief moment, the illusion of the man she had loved fought against the reality of the monster I had exposed. But Rachel was my daughter. She possessed a core of absolute iron that Trent had never managed to break. Her voice hardened into a quiet, deadly resolve. She asked me what we needed to do to stop him. I put the phone on speaker and placed it on Oliver's heavy desk. Oliver leaned forward and instructed Rachel to give him verbal authorization to execute an emergency financial injunction on her behalf. He explained that because we had photographic evidence of the severe bruising on her arm, and because we had documented evidence of Trent attempting to hire an involuntary psychiatric transport team under fraudulent pretenses, we met the strict legal threshold for emergency spousal abuse provisions. Oliver did not need to wait for a judge to review a standard divorce filing on Monday morning. He could invoke a specific federal banking statute designed to immediately protect the liquid assets of domestic violence victims fleeing their abusers. Rachel gave the verbal authorization without a single second of hesitation. Oliver nodded to his lead accountant standing by the door. The accountant rapidly typed a series of commands into his encrypted terminal, officially executing the ex parte freeze directly through the central banking authority. I stood in the quiet office and watched the large monitor on the wall. The digital routing request Trent had initiated glowed yellow on the screen, indicating it was pending approval from the fraud department due to the unusually large amount. Then suddenly, the text flashed a brilliant, undeniable red. The transaction was categorically denied. Oliver did not stop there. He executed the second phase of the financial strike. Using the emergency provisions, he systematically severed Trent's access to every single domestic account tied to Rachel's name. He completely froze their joint checking accounts, suspended the lines of credit attached to their shared mortgage, and placed an impenetrable lock on the mutual investment portfolios. In a matter of seconds, Oliver legally siphoned Rachel's entire half of the marital assets and redirected the funds into a blind, irrevocable trust that Trent could not even see, let alone touch. Oliver leaned back in his heavy leather chair and folded his hands. He stated calmly that Trent Lawson was now completely financially castrated. I picked up the phone and told Rachel that her money and her son's future were perfectly safe. I heard her let out a long, trembling sigh of relief, the sound of a woman finally taking the very first breath of true freedom. I told her to keep the motel door deadbolted and to order room service for Leo, promising I would be there soon. I hung up the phone and looked out the massive glass window at the sprawling city below. Trent was out there right now, wandering the streets, discovering that his entire empire of lies had just been evaporated by a few strokes of a keyboard through the mirrored access I still maintained on his encrypted laptop. I received a live notification detailing Trent's immediate panic. His mobile banking application was throwing continuous error codes. He was frantically trying to refresh his account balances, watching in absolute horror as every single available credit limit plummeted to zero. He had no access to cash. He could not leverage his home. He could not steal from his wife. The digital log showed his location pinging at a local bank branch just 3 miles from my house. He was desperate enough to try pulling physical cash directly from an automated teller machine. I imagined him standing on the pavement in his torn, expensive suit, sweating profusely in the morning sun. The system log updated again. Trent had inserted his primary platinum debit card into the machine. He had attempted to withdraw the maximum daily limit of $2,000. The transaction was instantly denied. He tried a second time, frantically punching the buttons on the keypad. The machine did not just decline the transaction. It officially flagged the card for severe fraud and swallowed the plastic, completely refusing to return it. Trent was left standing on the street with absolutely nothing. No leverage, no allies, and zero capital. He was a ghost in his own life. Just as the bank machine seized his final piece of plastic, a new notification intercepted on my screen. It was a text message bypassing his standard cellular provider, sent directly through the secure, peer-to-peer application the gambling syndicate used to communicate. The message did not contain any threats about his house or his job. The violent men he owed $500,000 to did not care about his frozen bank accounts or his legal troubles with his father-in-law. They only cared about the Friday night deadline. The anonymous sender transmitted a single terrifying sentence that flashed brightly across my monitor. "Time is up." The words "time is up" remained on the monitor for only a few seconds before the encrypted message erased itself. It did not need to stay any longer. The meaning was clear. Trent's deadline had expired, and the men he owed would no longer accept excuses. Oliver's forensic accountant continued monitoring the activity connected to Trent's devices. His phone moved rapidly between banking applications, credit portals, and private lending sites. But every attempt to obtain cash was rejected. He was no longer searching for a legal solution. He was searching for leverage. I looked at the secure transfer confirmation showing Rachel's savings and Leo's college fund safely protected inside the blind trust. Trent could not reach the money directly, but he knew who could authorize its release. Rachel was protected by Oliver's legal team. I was no longer an easy physical target. That left Leo. I did not need to wait for Trent to announce his next move. The motel had served its purpose as a temporary hiding place, but it was not designed to withstand an organized abduction. Its doors were thin, its cameras were unreliable, and my truck had been parked outside long enough for anyone searching the interstate corridor to identify it. I turned away from the monitor and looked directly at Oliver. "We move Rachel and Leo now," I said. "Before Trent sends someone to take the boy, he would try to take my grandson Leo to force Rachel to surrender the trust fund Oliver had just secured." I turned to Oliver and told him we needed to move my daughter and grandson immediately. The rundown motel on the outskirts of the city was a temporary blind spot, but it was not a fortress. Trent knew the make and model of my truck. If he hired cheap local muscle to scour the cheap motels along the interstate, they would eventually find it. Oliver did not hesitate. He told me his personal residence was a highly secured gated estate located 30 miles outside the city limits. It was equipped with reinforced steel doors and perimeter surveillance and a private security detail composed of former military contractors. It was the exact sanctuary my family needed. I drove back to the motel using a complex series of back roads to ensure we were not being followed. I walked into the dim room and found Rachel pacing the floor while Leo watched cartoons on the muted television. I calmly explained that we were upgrading our accommodations. I did not mention the specific threat of kidnapping to Rachel because she was already carrying the heavy trauma of the past 24 hours. I simply told her that Oliver had a safe house where she could finally rest without looking over her shoulder. We packed their small canvas bags and left the motel room exactly as it was. I drove them to the private estate of Oliver. The massive wrought iron gates swung open to reveal a sprawling stone house surrounded by dense, pristine forest. Armed guards nodded respectfully as we pulled into the long, circular driveway. I walked Rachel and Leo inside and watched the tension physically leave my daughter's shoulders when the heavy steel-reinforced front door locked behind us. She was finally safe. But my operation for the day was not complete. I hugged my grandson and kissed the forehead of my daughter. I told Rachel I had to go back into the city to finalize a few legal documents with Oliver. I walked back out to my truck and drove away from the fortified estate. I did not drive to the corporate law office. I drove straight back to the cheap neon-lit motel on the edge of the industrial district. I parked my truck behind an abandoned diner 2 blocks away and walked back to the motel on foot, keeping entirely to the shadows. I slipped back into the empty room and locked the flimsy wooden door. I closed the heavy blackout curtains and turned off every single light. I sat down in the corner of the room, merging completely into the darkness. I controlled my breathing and slowed my heart rate. I was no longer a grandfather comforting a frightened child. I was an active operative waiting for the enemy to step blindly into a fatal trap. I waited in the pitch-black room for 3 silent hours. The distant sound of highway traffic hummed a steady rhythm. Then the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel parking lot broke the quiet night. I heard the muffled voices of 2 men standing directly outside the motel room door. They were not attempting to be stealthy. They were loud and arrogant and completely untrained. Trent had not hired professional syndicate operators because he had no money to pay them. He had scraped together whatever cash he had left in his pocket to hire cheap local thugs who thought they were simply grabbing a terrified woman and a small child. A heavy metal crowbar smashed into the cheap wooden doorframe. The flimsy chain lock snapped instantly, and the door burst open. The harsh yellow light from the parking lot spilled into the dark room. 2 large men stepped over the threshold. They carried heavy wooden bats and wore cheap dark clothing. They scanned the empty beds and cursed under their breath, realizing their targets were not sleeping under the covers. They never even saw me move. I stepped out from the deep shadow of the corner in complete silence. I grabbed the first man by the back of his collar and the belt of his jeans. I used his own forward momentum to drive his face directly into the solid corner of the television stand. He dropped to the thin carpet, instantly incapacitated without making a single sound. The second man spun around, raising his heavy wooden bat in a blind panic. I stepped entirely inside his striking arc before he could swing. I delivered a precise, crushing palm strike to his solar plexus. The air violently escaped his lungs, and he doubled over in agonizing pain. I swept his legs out from under him and pinned him face down against the floor. I applied a specialized vascular neck restraint, restricting the blood flow, just enough to render him completely unconscious in a matter of seconds. The violent encounter was over in less than 10 seconds. Neither man had managed to shout a single word. I dragged their heavy, limp bodies toward the large cast-iron radiator bolted to the wall under the window. I retrieved a thick bundle of heavy-duty industrial zip ties from my jacket pocket. I secured their wrists and ankles tightly to the heavy iron pipes, ensuring they would not be able to move a single inch when they finally woke up. I systematically searched their pockets. I found a cheap disposable burner phone in the jacket of the first thug. I pressed the home button and opened the recent call log. The very last dialed number belonged to the personal cell phone of Trent Lawson. He had been checking in on their progress, expecting them to deliver his own son as a hostage. I opened the camera application on the burner phone. I stood over the 2 unconscious men secured firmly to the rusty radiator. I took a clear, high-resolution photograph of his hired muscle completely neutralized and helpless on the motel floor. I attached the image to a new text message. I typed in the personal phone number of my son-in-law. I did not write a threatening message. I did not demand a surrender. I simply hit send and let the photograph speak for itself. I photographed the burner phone's call history, copied the contact number, and removed the memory card before crushing the device beneath my boot. The 2 men would eventually wake up and explain themselves to the police, but they no longer mattered to the operation. The evidence connecting them to Trent was already secured. I left the motel through the rear service corridor and walked 2 blocks to where I had hidden my truck. By the time I reached Oliver's estate, the sky above the trees had begun to lighten. The perimeter guards opened the iron gates without delay. Inside the main house, Rachel and Leo were still asleep in the guest suite. For the first time since this began, my grandson was resting behind reinforced doors, with trained protection outside his window. I entered Oliver's private study and placed the recovered memory card beside the encrypted laptop. Before I could begin transferring the evidence, a high-priority alert appeared on Rachel's professional email account. The message had been sent from a newly created anonymous address. Its subject line read, "A final offer for your future." The timing told me everything. Trent knew the attempted kidnapping had failed. He had lost the ability to reach Leo physically, so he was changing weapons. He was going after Rachel's reputation, her career, and her legal right to remain a mother. I opened the message. Attached was a massive compressed folder filled with doctored invoices, manipulated video clips, and fabricated records designed to make Rachel appear dishonest, unstable, and professionally corrupt. Trent threatened to distribute the material to her clients, her employer, and the state child protection agency unless she surrendered the blind trust and forced me to sign over my estate. He had stopped trying to take my family by force. Now he was trying to destroy them with a lie. The email was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a perfectly calculated, utterly ruthless extortion attempt. Trent had attached a massive, highly compressed digital folder to the message. I opened the contents and found a sickening collection of fabricated evidence meticulously designed to destroy Rachel completely. There were doctored invoices suggesting she had been actively embezzling thousands of dollars from her top graphic design clients. There were manipulated out-of-context video clips of her crying and exhausted edited to make her look like a severely unstable, neglectful mother suffering from a psychotic breakdown. Trent had spent months secretly compiling this toxic portfolio. His written message was brief and dripping with arrogant cruelty. He explicitly threatened to mass email the entire fabricated folder to her professional network, her employers, and the State Child Protective Services by noon. He promised to ensure she would never work in her industry again, and that she would be legally stripped of all custody rights to little Leo. His only demand was absolute and non-negotiable. Rachel was to immediately sign over the blind trust Oliver had created, and she was to legally compel me to surrender the deed to my estate. He gave her exactly 4 hours to comply. Trent genuinely believed he had backed us into an inescapable corner. He thought he could use the threat of public humiliation and the loss of her child to force us to fund his escape from the violent loan shark syndicate. He still thought he was playing a game of emotional leverage against a soft suburban family. He had absolutely no idea that I had already cloned his entire digital life. I sat in the quiet study and drank my black coffee. I did not feel an ounce of panic. I did not bother drafting an angry defensive reply. Arguing with a cornered sociopathic rat is a profound waste of time. I needed to deliver a final crushing, undeniable counterstrike that would permanently shatter his leverage and force him into a blind panic. I opened the decryption drive containing the massive archive of data I had ripped from his personal laptop the night before. I bypassed his documents and navigated directly into his hidden cellular backup files. I knew that a man as paranoid and controlling as Trent would automatically record his own phone calls. I systematically combed through the audio files from the last 24 hours. It took me less than 10 minutes to find exactly what I was looking for. It was a crisp, clear audio recording of the frantic phone call Trent had made to the cheap local thugs 12 hours ago. I put on a pair of headphones and listened to the undeniable sound of my son-in-law committing a massive federal felony. His voice was sharp and desperate as he explicitly ordered the two men to break into the roadside motel. I listened to him negotiate the cash payment. I listened to him meticulously describe the layout of the motel room. And then I listened to the most damning sentence of all. He coldly instructed the men to forcefully drag his own 5-year-old son out of the bed and bring the boy to a secure location to be used as a bargaining chip against his wife. The sheer absolute depravity of his own words was enough to put him in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I highlighted the specific audio file and compressed it into a secure, untraceable format. I did not write a long, threatening message. I did not demand his surrender or offer him terms. I simply opened a blank email, attached the audio recording of his kidnapping solicitation, and forwarded it directly to his private, secure inbox. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and watched the digital delivery tracker. 2 minutes later, the read receipt triggered. I closed my eyes and vividly imagined Trent sitting alone in the ruins of his life, clicking on the audio file and listening to his own voice echo through the empty rooms of his house. I imagined the absolute suffocating terror gripping his throat as he finally realized the true magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to blackmail me with fabricated client invoices, and I had simply handed him the literal key to his own prison cell. His leverage was completely vaporized. He could never release the fake documents about Rachel, because he knew I would instantly hand the kidnapping audio over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had him entirely boxed in. He was totally isolated. His bank accounts were frozen solid. His hired muscle was tied to a rusty radiator, and the violent gambling syndicate was demanding $500,000 by tomorrow night. I turned my attention back to the live monitoring software I had secretly embedded in his laptop session. Stripped of his leverage, a desperate man will always run toward the only money he can still see. The keystroke logger on my monitor began to register rapid, frantic activity. Trent was no longer looking at his personal bank accounts or his legal files. He was actively logging into the highly secure, multi-million-dollar treasury portals of his own corporate employer. I was bypassing the standard accounting protocols and initiating unauthorized massive wire transfers. I watched the screen as he began to blindly and recklessly embezzle corporate funds, preparing to steal enough cash to satisfy the loan sharks and book a one-way untraceable flight out of the country. His company was hosting a massive, high-profile corporate gala. The very next evening, an event where Trent was scheduled to speak in front of hundreds of wealthy investors. He was planning to use the chaos and distraction of the gala to finalize the stolen transfers and slip away into the night like a coward. He thought he was finally finding a way out of the trap. He did not realize that I was watching every single digit he typed, and that I was going to be waiting for him at the gala to tear his entire world apart in front of everyone he knew. I sat deep in the heavy leather chair in the office of Oliver Stanton and kept my eyes locked on the glowing monitor mounted to the mahogany wall. Trent was navigating the corporate treasury portal of his employer with the reckless, frantic speed of a drowning man gasping for air. We had intercepted his session credentials an hour ago, and now every single keystroke he made was mirrored perfectly on our screen. He was bypassing the standard security authorization protocols using high-level executive override codes he had likely stolen from his own superiors. The digital numbers flashing across the monitor were absolutely staggering. He was manually queuing up an international wire transfer for exactly $500,000. It was the precise amount of cash he needed to pay off the violent gambling syndicate and secure a one-way untraceable flight out of the country. If that money managed to cross international borders and land in an unregulated offshore holding account, Trent would vanish into the wind like a ghost. He would escape the consequences of his abuse and leave my daughter to pick up the shattered pieces of her life. I turned to Oliver and told him that we could not simply use domestic abuse provisions to freeze a massive multinational corporate treasury account. We needed a much heavier weapon. Oliver did not blink. He picked up his desk phone and summoned his lead forensic accountant back into the spacious office. The accountant was a quiet, meticulous man who moved with absolute silent precision. Oliver instructed him to trace the digital fingerprint of the massive transaction Trent was currently attempting to execute. We needed to prove unauthorized access and malicious intent to trigger an automatic security lock within the corporate banking infrastructure. The accountant bypassed the graphical front end of the financial portal and accessed the raw scrolling data stream underneath. He began to pull the complete historical transactional records of Trent Lawson. What we found hidden in the digital archives was not a single desperate act of theft committed by a frightened man. It was a massive, highly organized 4-year history of systematic corporate embezzlement. Trent had been silently siphoning money from his company for years to cover his initial mounting gambling losses. The accountant pulled up file after file of undeniable proof. Trent had created dozens of fictitious vendor accounts under fake corporate names. He had manipulated quarterly expense reports to hide the bleeding capital. He had even digitally forged the authorization signatures of 2 different chief financial officers to bypass internal company audits. We watched in silence as the accountant compiled the digital evidence into a single cohesive file. He isolated every single fake invoice and tracked every fraudulent routing number back to the hidden offshore accounts of my son-in-law. He built an impenetrable chronological timeline of criminal activity. The dossier grew from a few scattered pages into a massive, comprehensive catalog of federal wire fraud. Trent was not just a desperate, abusive husband trying to flee a violent loan shark. He was a prolific white-collar criminal who had been silently stealing millions of dollars over the span of 48 months. I looked at the comprehensive digital file resting on the server. It was a loaded weapon, perfectly calibrated and ready to be fired. Oliver picked up his secure mobile phone. He did not dial the local police precinct or the county sheriff. He dialed a direct unlisted line to a senior contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White-Collar Crime Division, in Washington. The man on the other end of the line was Special Agent Davis. Oliver had worked closely alongside Davis during a massive, high-profile corporate corruption trial 5 years ago. They shared a mutual respect built on putting dangerous men behind bars. Oliver spoke into the receiver in a low, perfectly calm voice. He informed the federal agent that he was transmitting a fully compiled 0-day fraud dossier regarding an active, highly desperate executive flight risk. Oliver hit the send key on his terminal. The heavily encrypted file vanished into the federal servers. We sat in the quiet office and waited in absolute silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room was the only sound. Exactly 14 minutes later, the phone on the heavy wooden desk rang. Oliver answered it on speaker. It was Special Agent Davis. His tone had shifted from casual professional courtesy to the sharp, focused edge of an active federal investigator. He confirmed immediate receipt of the dossier. He stated clearly that the digital evidence Oliver had provided was completely undeniable, perfectly documented, and actionable. He informed us that the federal government was immediately intercepting the $500,000 wire transfer Trent had just initiated. They placed the massive transfer into a covert digital holding pattern. On his laptop screen, Trent would see a standard loading graphic indicating the payment was processing normally. He would believe he had successfully stolen the money, but the funds were actually frozen solid inside a federal honeypot trap. His escape fund was completely, totally neutralized without him even realizing it. Special Agent Davis continued briefing us on the immediate tactical response. The Bureau was fast-tracking a federal arrest warrant for Trent Lawson. They were officially charging him with multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, grand corporate embezzlement, and attempting to flee a federal jurisdiction. But the agents did not want to arrest him at his suburban home. They knew from the dossier that he was a desperate man facing severe debt from a violent criminal syndicate. They wanted to entirely avoid a potential barricade situation or a violent standoff in a quiet residential neighborhood. Davis informed us that the Bureau had pulled the professional itinerary of his target. Trent was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at his own corporate charity gala the following evening. The gala was being held in a massive, highly populated luxury hotel ballroom downtown. The federal agents planned to infiltrate the event wearing civilian evening wear. They would corner him in a highly controlled, well-lit public environment, where he would be completely separated from his vehicle and entirely surrounded by his own professional network and investors. They were going to execute a quiet, clean, covert operation to take him into federal custody before he could even attempt to run. It was the perfect trap. It would strip him of his freedom and his carefully crafted professional reputation in a single devastating moment. Oliver thanked the federal agent and ended the secure call. He leaned back in his leather chair and looked across the mahogany desk at me. He told me that my part in this military operation was officially over. He advised me to drive back to the fortified stone estate and stay with Rachel and little Leo and let the federal government handle the rest of the garbage cleanup. He told me I had won the war and secured my family. I stood up slowly from the heavy leather chair. I looked at the glowing monitor on the wall, still displaying the frozen trapped bank accounts of the man who had violently bruised the arm of my daughter and threatened to kidnap my young grandson. I thought about the sheer terror I had seen in the eyes of Rachel sitting on the cold kitchen floor. I shook my head. I looked Oliver dead in the eye and told him I was absolutely not staying hidden at the safe house. I told him I was going to purchase a perfectly tailored tuxedo, and I was going to walk directly through the front doors of that luxury hotel ballroom tomorrow night. I had spent the last 48 hours hiding in damp basements and dark motel rooms and secure offices, dismantling his entire life from the shadows. I had operated exactly like a ghost, but I was not a ghost. I was a father. I needed Trent to see my face when the federal handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. I needed him to look deep into the eyes of the frail, forgetful old man he thought he had successfully broken. I needed him to finally understand exactly whose house he had arrogantly tried to steal, and I needed to watch his world end with my own two eyes. The ballroom of the luxury hotel was a cavern of crystal chandeliers and expensive silk drapery. 300 of the wealthiest investors and corporate executives in the city sat at round tables covered in pristine white linen. I stood near the center aisle wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. The private security guards Oliver had frozen with his federal credentials stepped back, melting into the shadows along the velvet walls. Up on the raised stage, Trent stood behind a clear acrylic podium. He was drowning in his own panic, but he was a cornered animal trying to use his only remaining weapon, which was his ability to manipulate a crowd. He gripped the edges of the podium so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white under the bright stage lights. He leaned into the sleek silver microphone, and his voice trembled perfectly, playing the role of a devastated, loving family man facing a sudden personal tragedy. He looked out at his board of directors and the wealthy donors sitting in the front row, and he began to spin a pathetic, desperate lie. He apologized for the sudden interruption and told the massive crowd that the elderly man standing in the aisle was his severely ill father-in-law. He claimed with a trembling voice that I was suffering from aggressive, late-stage Alzheimer's disease. He told the silent ballroom that I had tragically wandered away from a secure memory care facility earlier that evening, and that my sudden appearance here was the result of a terrifying paranoid delusion. He placed a hand over his heart and asked the hundreds of guests for their patience and their deep sympathy during this incredibly painful, private family ordeal. He signaled to the remaining hotel staff to please gently escort his confused, sick father-in-law back to the lobby where medical professionals were supposedly waiting. It was a masterful performance, delivered by a true sociopath who believed he could talk his way out of a burning building. I did not let the hotel staff touch me. I did not raise my hands or shout defensively. I simply began to walk down the wide center aisle toward the stage. My posture was perfectly straight, and my strides were measured and deliberate. The wealthy guests sitting at the tables watched me closely, expecting to see the shuffling, erratic movements of a broken man lost in the fog of dementia. Instead, they saw a man moving with the cold, undeniable precision of a military officer. The whispered conversations around the room began to die down as I reached the short flight of stairs leading up to the stage. I climbed the steps and walked directly toward the acrylic podium where Trent was standing. He tried to step in front of me to block my path, attempting to play the role of the protective caregiver gently corralling a wandering patient. He reached out to place his hands on my shoulders while whispering a frantic threat under his breath, telling me I was making a fatal mistake. I did not engage in a childish wrestling match. I simply reached out and clamped my hand over his wrist. I applied a highly specific tactical pressure to the nerve cluster just above his joint. It was completely invisible to the audience below, but the agonizing pain shot directly up his arm. Trent gasped softly, and his knees buckled just a fraction of an inch. I stepped past him and took the silver microphone smoothly from his trembling fingers. I stood at the center of the stage and looked out over the sea of expensive suits and evening gowns. I did not ask for their pity or their sympathy. I spoke with absolute chilling clarity. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute truth. I introduced myself not as a confused patient, but as a retired combat veteran who had just spent the last 48 hours uncovering a massive criminal conspiracy orchestrated by the man standing behind me. I told the silent crowd that Trent Lawson was not a dedicated family man or a successful corporate leader. I stated plainly that he was an abusive, desperate, high-stakes gambling addict who owed $500,000 to a violent underground syndicate. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. I heard the sudden sharp clinking of silverware dropping onto china plates. Trent tried to lunge forward to snatch the microphone back, shouting that I was hallucinating and begging the crowd not to listen to my insane ramblings. I did not even look at him. I simply reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope I had secured at the veteran hospital that morning. I walked down the short flight of stairs, leaving Trent stranded on the stage, and headed directly for the VIP table in the very front row. Sitting at that table were the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, and the senior board members of the corporation Trent worked for. These were the men and women who controlled his entire professional existence. They looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep apprehension. I opened the manila envelope and pulled out the thick stack of official medical documents. I did not hand them a scribbled note or an amateur accusation. I handed the chief executive officer the fully certified, heavily stamped neurological evaluation performed by 3 independent board-certified military doctors. I told the executives sitting at the table to look at the federal notary seals and read the official diagnosis for themselves. I explained that my cognitive function and psychological stress responses had been evaluated just hours ago and certified to be in the top 1 percentile of the population. I told them to read the exact lines where the top neurologists in the region legally declared that I showed absolutely zero signs of any degenerative brain disease. I explained that the tragic story Trent had just tried to sell them was a desperate smokescreen designed to cover up a fraudulent medical petition he had filed to steal my family estate. The chief executive officer adjusted his glasses and began reading the certified medical documents. The chief financial officer leaned over his shoulder to read the undeniable federal stamps validating the paperwork. I stood there and calmly informed them that my lawyer, Oliver Stanton, had already forwarded a massive secondary dossier to their corporate auditing department, outlining years of systemic embezzlement committed by Trent. I told them that the $500,000 offshore wire transfer Trent had attempted to execute just hours ago was currently frozen inside a federal evidence trap. The executives at the table went completely pale. The illusion of Trent Lawson, the rising corporate star, cracked and shattered right in front of their eyes. They looked up from the undeniable medical proof and stared at the man standing alone on the stage. The murmurs sweeping through the luxury ballroom were no longer filled with pity for a sick old man. They were filled with absolute disgust and raw horror aimed directly at the desperate liar sweating under the stage lights. Trent stood paralyzed behind the acrylic podium, watching his entire carefully constructed empire evaporate into nothingness. He saw the wealthy investors whispering furiously to one another. He saw the senior board members glaring at him with cold, calculating fury. He realized in that agonizing moment that he had absolutely no money left, no legal leverage remaining, and now his professional reputation was completely annihilated. The crushing reality of his total, inescapable defeat finally broke his mind. The senior executives continued reading the neurological evaluations, while the murmurs in the ballroom grew louder. Trent watched the people who had once admired him turn toward one another with expressions of disgust and suspicion. His professional identity was collapsing in real time. He stepped away from the podium. For one brief second, I thought he might run toward the service exit. Instead, his face twisted with blind rage. The polished executive disappeared, leaving only the violent man Rachel had been forced to live with behind closed doors. "You destroyed everything," he screamed. He jumped down from the stage and charged directly at me. Guests at the nearest tables scrambled backward, knocking over crystal glasses and floral centerpieces. Trent raised his right fist as he crossed the final few feet, committing his entire weight to a wild strike aimed at my jaw. He expected the trembling old man from the dinner table. He had forgotten the man who put him on the bedroom floor. He launched his entire body weight forward, completely abandoning any sense of self-preservation or rational thought. The wealthy guests sitting at the front tables shrieked and scrambled backward, knocking over expensive crystal wine glasses and heavy floral centerpieces in their desperate rush to get out of his way. Trent closed the short distance between us with his eyes wide and completely unhinged, violently swinging his arm in a wide, desperate arc aimed squarely at my face. He fully expected me to cower or raise my hands in a frail defensive panic. He had completely forgotten the silent lesson I had taught him on the floor of my master bedroom just one night ago. He was charging blindly into a brick wall. Trent was moving with the reckless momentum of a man who had completely lost his mind. He crossed the short distance between us in heavy, uncoordinated strides. His expensive leather shoes slipped slightly on the polished hardwood of the stage, but he kept coming. He pulled his right arm back, telegraphing a wild, looping punch aimed directly at my jaw. He put every ounce of his body weight into the swing, fully expecting to feel the satisfying crunch of bone. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to raise my hands in a frail, trembling panic, just like I had done in my kitchen 2 nights ago. He was an arrogant corporate bully who had only ever intimidated terrified subordinates and his own wife. He had absolutely no concept of actual violence. He did not know how to distribute his weight or protect his centerline. He was simply throwing a blind, desperate temper tantrum in front of 300 horrified witnesses. I did not blink. I did not step backward to retreat. I watched his fist arc through the bright stage lights, and it felt as though time had slowed down to an absolute crawl. 40 years of deeply ingrained muscle memory took over completely, bypassing conscious thought. I stepped smoothly to the inside of his attack, shifting my weight and completely avoiding his wild strike. The momentum of his missed punch pulled him entirely off balance. I raised my left hand and delivered a sharp upward palm strike directly under his extended elbow joint, forcing his arm to hyperextend. Trent let out a sudden choked gasp of pain as the joint locked up. Before he could even attempt to recover his footing, I stepped firmly behind his right leg. I gripped the heavy fabric of his custom-tailored suit jacket at the shoulder and the lower back. With a single fluid motion, I swept his leg out from under him and drove him face first into the floor of the stage. The impact was a loud, hollow thud that echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. Trent hit the polished wood hard, entirely knocking the wind out of his lungs. I did not give him a single fraction of a second to struggle or attempt a counterattack. I dropped my knee squarely into the center of his upper spine, pinning him flat against the floor, with the exact amount of localized pressure required to paralyze his movements without snapping his vertebrae. I grabbed his right wrist and twisted it sharply up between his shoulder blades, locking his arm in a brutal submission hold. He tried to thrash his legs and heave his torso off the ground, but I shifted my weight effortlessly, rendering him completely, totally immobile. He was trapped under me like a helpless insect caught under a heavy stone. The hundreds of wealthy investors and corporate executives sitting in the ballroom were absolutely dead silent. They watched in sheer disbelief as the frail elderly father-in-law flawlessly dismantled their chief executive in less than 3 seconds. The illusion of my declining health and cognitive failure had been entirely shattered by a display of overwhelming tactical dominance. But I was not paying any attention to the audience sitting at the luxury tables below us. I leaned down, bringing my face just an inch away from the ear of my son-in-law. His breath was coming in ragged, frantic gasps, and I could feel the cold sweat soaking through the collar of his expensive dress shirt. I lowered my voice to a harsh, dead whisper, ensuring that only he could hear the words I was about to say. I told him to stop moving. The absolute freezing authority in my tone made his entire body freeze instinctively. I told him that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation when he looked at my gray hair and my quiet demeanor and assumed I was weak. I told him that I did not spend my life pushing paper in a corporate office or bullying women behind closed doors. I told him that I spent 24 years serving as a chief petty officer in the United States Navy Sea, Air, and Land delivery teams. I whispered that my operational call sign was Ghost, and that I had spent 2 decades hunting the most dangerous, violent men on the planet through the darkest corners of the earth. I told him about the desert deployments, and the mountain raids, and the silent extractions. I made sure he understood that violence was not a desperate reaction for me, but a native language I had spoken fluently long before he was even born. I pressed my knee just a millimeter deeper into his spine to emphasize my point. I told Trent that compared to the warlords and the insurgents I had neutralized in my career, he was nothing more than a pathetic, weak coward throwing a temper tantrum. I explained that the only reason he was currently breathing and not permanently broken was because my daughter asked me not to hurt the father of her son. I told him I had completely dismantled his entire fraudulent empire in 48 hours without even breaking a sweat, because he was a civilian who brought a fake medical document to a kinetic war. I asked him if he finally understood exactly who he had locked in his basement room. I asked him if he finally realized that the frail old man he thought he could discard and steal from was the single most dangerous human being he would ever meet in his miserable, pathetic life. I felt the fight completely leave his body. The rigid, tense muscles in his shoulders instantly turned to heavy, useless lead. He stopped trying to pull his arm free. He lay flat against the cold, hardwood floor, completely defeated. I could hear a soft, pathetic whimpering sound escaping his throat. It was the sound of a man whose enormous, inflated ego had just been entirely crushed under the unbearable weight of reality. Trent finally understood the absolute, terrifying magnitude of his mistake. He had invited an apex predator into his home and handed him the keys to his own destruction. He realized that every single moment of his supposed dominance over the past year had been a complete illusion. I had allowed him to think he was winning simply because I was observing his tactics and gathering intelligence. He knew now that his money was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and his physical body was completely at my mercy. I kept him pinned to the floor of the stage, letting the humiliating silence stretch out across the massive luxury ballroom. The wealthy donors and the powerful board members simply stared at the pathetic display of their ruined colleague. No one stepped forward to help him. No hotel security guards rushed the stage to pull me off. They all knew exactly what they were witnessing. They were watching a predator get caught in his own snare. The air in the room was thick with the absolute, undeniable truth of his total failure. He was fully exposed to the world as an abuser, a fraud, and a coward. Then a heavy metallic crash broke the profound silence of the room. The massive double oak doors at the very back of the luxury ballroom were violently thrown open. The heavy brass handles slammed against the plaster walls, causing the expensive crystal chandeliers to rattle above our heads. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers and stern professional expressions stepped rapidly over the threshold. The letters spelling out the Federal Bureau of Investigation were printed in bold yellow font across their backs. The agents moved into the room with absolute authority, scanning the crowd and securing the exits. The final phase of the operation had officially arrived. The trap I had built alongside Oliver was springing shut, and Trent Lawson was about to trade his tailored suit for federal handcuffs. Special Agent Davis led the federal team through the center aisle, while the other agents spread across the ballroom and secured every exit. No one in the audience attempted to interfere. Their attention remained fixed on Trent, still pinned beneath my knee on the polished floor. I kept my knee pressed firmly against the spine of my son-in-law for one more deliberate second, ensuring he fully felt the weight of his total defeat. Then I slowly and smoothly stood up. I stepped back and took a calm, measured breath, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored tuxedo jacket. I did not look like a man who had just been in a physical altercation. I looked like a man who had just finished a routine chore. Trent remained on the polished hardwood of the stage for a moment, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement. His expensive dress shirt was torn at the shoulder. His hair was plastered to his forehead with cold sweat, as his panicked eyes darted around the room and registered the federal badges clipping onto the belts of the approaching agents. His survival instinct kicked in. He genuinely believed he could still manipulate his way out of a burning building. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet, using the clear acrylic podium to support his trembling weight. He pointed a shaking, bruised finger directly at my chest and began to shout at the top of his lungs. He screamed to the approaching agents that they needed to arrest me immediately. He played the role of the desperate victim with absolute, shameless conviction. He shouted that I was a violently deranged dementia patient who had broken into a highly secure private corporate event. He claimed I had brutally attacked him without any provocation and that I was currently hallucinating. He begged the agents to call for an emergency medical transport to have me sedated and dragged away for the safety of everyone in the room. He looked at the chief executive officer and the wealthy board members sitting at the front tables, hoping to see them nodding in agreement. But the executives just stared at him with profound disgust, holding the certified neurological evaluations I had just handed them. The lead federal agent stepped away from the tactical formation and walked directly toward the stage. It was Special Agent Davis, the man Oliver had contacted from the corporate law office earlier that afternoon. Davis was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp, assessing eyes and a completely neutral expression. He walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped onto the stage. He did not look at me with any suspicion or hostility. He simply gave me a brief, silent nod of profound professional respect, acknowledging the clean extraction I had set up for his team. Then Davis turned his cold, unblinking attention directly to the sweating, panicked man standing behind the podium. Trent tried to take a step forward, attempting to shake the hand of the federal agent while pouring out another pathetic layer of fabricated lies. He opened his mouth to explain how I was framing him with fake medical documents. Special Agent Davis did not let him finish a single sentence. He did not argue or ask for a polite explanation. Davis simply reached out, grabbed Trent by his torn shoulder, and spun him around with overwhelming physical force. He slammed Trent face first against the clear acrylic podium. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Trent's wrists echoed loudly over the silent, horrified ballroom. Trent gasped in absolute shock. He tried to squirm against the grip of the federal agent, shouting that this was a massive misunderstanding and a catastrophic violation of his rights. He demanded to call his corporate lawyers. He screamed that he was the victim of an insane old man. Special Agent Davis ignored his pathetic whining completely. Keeping one heavy hand firmly pressed against the back of Trent's neck, Davis recited the Miranda rights with cold, practiced mechanical efficiency. When he finished reciting those rights, Davis leaned in close to the microphone resting on the podium. He wanted every single wealthy investor and corporate board member in that massive room to hear exactly what was happening. Davis spoke in a loud, booming voice, listing the specific federal charges one by one, like heavy nails being driven into a wooden coffin. He announced that Trent Lawson was officially under federal arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud and grand corporate embezzlement, stretching back over 48 months. He listed the charge of conspiracy to commit medical fraud, and then Davis delivered the final devastating blow. He announced the charge of solicitation of kidnapping. He stated clearly that they had undeniable audio evidence of Trent attempting to hire violent local thugs to forcefully abduct his own 5-year-old son. A collective gasp of raw horror ripped through the luxury ballroom. The wealthy women sitting in their evening gowns covered their mouths in shock. The powerful executives who had trusted Trent with millions of dollars shook their heads in absolute revulsion. Any lingering shred of professional respect or human sympathy Trent might have hoped to salvage was instantly completely vaporized. He was entirely exposed as a monster who viewed his own child as disposable collateral. Trent tried to fight against the heavy steel handcuffs digging into his skin. His voice cracked into a high-pitched, desperate whine. He sobbed loudly, claiming that the audio recordings were totally faked and that the financial documents were illegally altered. He screamed that I was a rogue military operative who had hacked his life and framed him to steal his money. He begged the federal agent to believe that there was absolutely zero credible proof tying him to any fraudulent medical conspiracy. He shouted that his private physician would back up his claims and prove I was legally insane. Special Agent Davis smiled a very small, very cold smile. He signaled to the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. 2 more federal agents walked over the threshold. They were physically dragging a man between them who was struggling to keep his balance. The man was wearing a wrinkled, rumpled suit. He was sweating profusely, and his hands were secured tightly behind his back with steel handcuffs. It was Dr. Elliot Sterling, the corrupt, unethical physician who had signed the fake neurological evaluations declaring me violently insane. Trent stopped thrashing against the podium. The last drop of blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, trembling ghost. He stared at his corrupt accomplice being hauled down the center aisle of his own corporate gala, like a common street criminal. Special Agent Davis leaned close to Trent's ear, but spoke loudly enough for the front row to hear perfectly. Davis informed my son-in-law that federal agents had visited Dr. Sterling at his private clinic just 3 hours ago, confronted with the overwhelming digital evidence Oliver had provided. The good doctor had immediately realized he was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. Sterling had entirely abandoned his wealthy corporate client without a single second of hesitation. To secure a lighter sentence for himself, the corrupt doctor had completely flipped. He had provided the Federal Bureau with a full comprehensive recorded confession detailing exactly how much cash Trent had paid him to forge those medical documents. Trent realized in that agonizing, terrifying moment that there was absolutely no way out. The walls of his inescapable trap had finally closed completely. He had no money left to hire expensive defense attorneys. He had no hired muscle to intimidate witnesses. His professional network had just watched his entire life burn to the ground, and his only remaining accomplice had just handed the federal government the exact matching puzzle piece they needed to bury him under the prison. His legs finally gave out. The sheer crushing weight of his catastrophic failure broke the last remaining strings of his physical control. He collapsed against the acrylic podium, sobbing loudly and pathetically in front of the 300 people he had spent years trying to impress. Special Agent Davis and a second agent hoisted Trent roughly by his arms. They did not show him an ounce of gentle respect. They dragged him away from the podium and pulled him down the short flight of stairs. I stood silently on the stage and watched the federal agents march the ruined man down the wide center aisle of the luxury ballroom. The wealthy guests actively shrank back in their chairs, pulling their silk gowns and tailored jackets out of the way to avoid touching him as he passed. Trent wept openly, his expensive shoes dragging uselessly against the plush carpet. I watched the heavy oak doors swing shut behind him, completely severing him from the world of power and privilege he had so desperately tried to maintain. The silence he left behind in the grand ballroom was absolute. The war was officially over. The morning after the gala, the federal courthouse smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. I sat in a rigid wooden chair inside a sterile gray conference room located deep within the district attorney office. The adrenaline from the ballroom had completely faded, leaving behind a cold and absolute focus. I was wearing a simple dark suit blending perfectly into the bureaucratic background. Sitting directly beside me was Oliver Stanton. He looked perfectly rested and entirely dangerous. Across the wide wooden table sat the Assistant United States Attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Harris, who had spent her entire career prosecuting corrupt executives. Sitting next to her was the defense attorney Trent had managed to secure with his one allowed phone call. The defense attorney was a slick, fast-talking man who specialized in white-collar damage control. He clearly did not understand the true magnitude of the situation. He opened his leather binder and began to aggressively pitch a highly sanitized version of reality. He tried to paint Trent as a dedicated family man who had simply crumbled under the immense pressure of corporate expectations. He argued that the embezzlement was a temporary lapse in judgment, and that Trent was fully prepared to offer total restitution to his employer in exchange for a quiet plea deal. He suggested a few years of probation and a minimum security facility. He claimed that dragging a respected suburban father through a massive public trial would only cause unnecessary trauma to his young wife and child. I sat silently and listened to the defense attorney attempt to excuse away the monster who had bruised my daughter. I did not need to raise my voice or interrupt him. I simply looked at Oliver. Oliver did not argue with the lawyer. He did not debate the semantics of corporate stress or white-collar sentencing guidelines. He calmly opened his heavy briefcase and pulled out the massive printed dossier his forensic accountants had compiled. He slid the thick stack of financial documents across the smooth wooden table. He told the defense attorney to look closely at the systematic 4-year history of wire fraud and the fake vendor accounts. He explained that Trent was not a stressed employee making a mistake, but a prolific calculating thief who had stolen millions of dollars over 48 months. The defense attorney glanced at the financial records and swallowed hard, but he tried to maintain his professional composure. He argued that financial crimes were nonviolent, and that his client still deserved the opportunity to negotiate bail and return home to his family while the trial was pending. Oliver removed a small digital recorder from his pocket and placed it in the center of the table. He pressed the play button without offering an explanation. Trent's voice filled the room. The recording was brief, clear, and impossible to reinterpret. He identified the motel negotiated payment with the two men and ordered them to abduct Leo for use as leverage against Rachel. Oliver stopped the recording immediately after Trent gave the final instruction. No one spoke. The defense attorney's expression changed first. The confidence disappeared from his face as he slowly closed the binder in front of him. Prosecutor Harris stared at the recorder for several seconds before turning toward Trent's attorney. "There will be no negotiated release and no request for leniency," she said. "Your client attempted to weaponize his own child." At that moment, the financial crimes ceased to be the center of the case. Trent was no longer merely an executive accused of stealing money. He was a father who had solicited the violent abduction of a 5-year-old boy. The reaction in the room was absolute and immediate. The color completely drained from the face of the defense attorney. He slowly closed his leather binder and stared at the digital recorder with profound professional horror. He realized instantly that his client had lied to him by omission and that he was sitting in a room trying to defend an indefensible monster. Prosecutor Harris gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes narrowed with pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked directly at the defense attorney and stated with absolute freezing authority that there would be absolutely no plea deals offered to his client today or any other day. She informed him that she was going to personally ensure Trent Lawson received the absolute maximum sentence allowed under federal law. An hour later, we relocated to the main courtroom for the official arraignment and the bail hearing. I sat in the second row of the heavy wooden gallery benches. The heavy double doors beside the judge's bench opened, and two federal marshals led Trent into the courtroom. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored suit. He was dressed in a standard-issue shapeless orange jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were secured with heavy steel chains that rattled loudly with every single step he took. He looked completely broken. The arrogant posture was gone, entirely replaced by the trembling, exhausted shuffle of a terrified prisoner. He glanced back into the gallery, and his eyes met mine. I did not smile or show a single ounce of emotion. I just looked right through him. The federal judge was a stern, imposing man with decades of experience on the bench. He read the long, devastating list of charges aloud for the court record. When he finished reading the charges, the defense attorney stood up. He dutifully requested that his client be granted bail, citing his lack of previous criminal history and his ties to the local community. Prosecutor Harris immediately stood up to object. She did not just read a prepared statement. She presented the audio transcript of the kidnapping solicitation directly to the judge. She explained that the defendant had actively attempted to use violent mercenaries to abduct a 5-year-old child just 48 hours prior. The judge read the transcript and looked down from his high bench at the trembling man standing in the orange jumpsuit. The expression on the face of the judge was one of pure, unfiltered revulsion. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. He announced to the silent courtroom that a father who would willingly endanger the life of his own young child to cover up a financial crime was a profound danger to society. He categorically denied the request for bail. He declared Trent an extreme flight risk and ordered him to be remanded immediately to the custody of the federal penitentiary until the conclusion of the trial. The marshals grabbed Trent by his arms and dragged him out of the courtroom. He did not look back at me a second time. I walked out of the federal courthouse with Oliver into the bright afternoon sun. The legal strike was perfectly executed, and my son-in-law was safely locked behind thick steel bars. But the unseen consequences of his actions were still playing out in the shadows. When we returned to the corporate law office, Oliver's lead forensic accountant was waiting for us with an urgent update. He had been continuously monitoring the hidden offshore accounts Trent had tried to use to funnel the stolen corporate money. The accountant pointed to the large monitor on the wall. A new massive wave of digital activity had just triggered an alert on the server. The violent loan shark syndicate had seen the breaking local news reports detailing the dramatic arrest of a prominent corporate executive at a luxury hotel gala. The dangerous men Trent owed $500,000 to realized instantly that their debtor was locked in a federal cage and their money was entirely at risk. They did not wait to send threatening text messages or call his phone. They utilized their own network of illicit digital operators. We watched the monitor in absolute silence as the syndicate hackers forcefully breached the security protocols of Trent's remaining hidden offshore accounts. They systematically and ruthlessly drained every single remaining cent he had quietly hidden away over the years. They took the funds to cover his massive gambling debts, and they took the rest as a penalty for the inconvenience of his arrest. The digital account balances plummeted rapidly, flashing across the screen until they hit absolute zero. Trent was currently sitting on a thin mattress inside a cold, concrete federal holding cell entirely isolated from the outside world. He did not yet know that the digital strike had just occurred. He was completely unaware that the very last fraction of his hidden wealth had just been totally wiped out by the same violent men he had tried to escape. He had lost his job, his reputation, his family, and his freedom. And now the Shadow Syndicate had ensured he was left entirely, utterly destitute. The federal courthouse was a massive, intimidating labyrinth of polished marble floors and echoing high-ceilinged hallways. While Trent was currently being processed, stripped of his personal belongings, and locked inside a subterranean holding facility. Oliver led Rachel and me into a private secured suite of offices belonging to the district attorney. We had decisively won the kinetic war in the motel room, and we had secured the ultimate federal victory in the luxury ballroom, but the bureaucratic cleanup was absolutely vital. Trent had left a massive toxic crater in the very center of my daughter's life. We needed to pour thick legal concrete over that crater before the dust could even settle. If we left a single legal loophole open or a single document unsealed, the Shadow Syndicate or Trent's aggressive bankruptcy creditors might try to come after Rachel for his massive offshore debts. Oliver was absolutely not going to let that happen. He had brought two of his senior family law partners with him from his corporate firm, and they had spent the entire night drafting an impenetrable fortress of legal documents. I sat in a heavy leather chair and watched my daughter sitting across from the long, polished wooden conference table. She looked utterly exhausted. Her eyes were lined with deep dark circles from days of sheer terror and sleepless nights spent hiding in fortified safe houses. But as the senior lawyers placed the thick, heavy stacks of paper in front of her, I saw a profound, undeniable spark of resilience lighting up her pale face. In a standard civilian divorce, separating shared marital assets and determining child custody can drag on for agonizing months or even years. It is a grueling, emotionally draining process designed to wear down the spirit of the victim. But Oliver Stanton was not playing by standard civilian rules. Because we had handed the federal government undeniable audio proof of Trent actively soliciting violent mercenaries to abduct a 5-year-old child, the family court judge had completely bypassed the traditional mandatory waiting periods. The pending federal kidnapping charges, combined with the documented photographic evidence of physical spousal abuse, triggered an immediate and absolute termination of all parental rights for Trent Lawson. Rachel did not have to sit in a mediation room and negotiate with the monster who had terrorized her. She did not have to agree to supervised weekend visits or split holidays. She picked up the heavy brass pen provided by the attorney and signed her name firmly on the dotted line. With that single decisive stroke of ink, she was granted full sole and undisputed legal custody of little Leo. Trent was permanently and legally barred from ever coming within 500 feet of his own son again. I watched her hand tremble slightly as she signed the final page of the expedited divorce decree. It was not a tremble of fear or hesitation. It was the physical release of years of suffocating emotional manipulation finally leaving her body. The heavy invisible chains that had bound her to a narcissistic sociopath were completely and permanently severed. Once Rachel was entirely insulated from the criminal fallout, Oliver turned his sharp, focused attention directly to me. Trent had originally started this entire nightmare because he arrogantly believed my home and my military pension were soft, easy targets. He thought he could simply forge a medical document, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and liquidate everything I had built to pay off his underground gambling debts. Oliver was going to make absolutely sure that no one could ever attempt that specific maneuver against me ever again. He slid a separate stack of legal affidavits across the smooth mahogany table. These documents were meticulously designed to place my suburban home, my life savings, and my government pensions into a series of deeply nested, irrevocable blind trusts. Oliver explained the complex mechanics of the trusts in a low, calm voice. By transferring the total ownership of my physical assets into these highly secure legal entities, I was effectively removing my own name from the public financial registry entirely. I would still retain complete operational control over my money and my property. But on paper, I possessed absolutely nothing that could be seized, sued for, or stolen by a fraudulent power of attorney. If the violent loan shark syndicate ever tried to dig into my background to recover the money Trent had lost, they would find a massive, impenetrable concrete wall. I read through the dense legal jargon carefully, ensuring every single clause was watertight and flawlessly executed. I picked up the brass pen and signed my name, officially locking down the sanctuary I had built for my family. The entire legal process took less than 3 hours. It was a masterpiece of ruthless corporate efficiency. The lawyers gathered the signed documents, stamped them with heavy official state seals, and filed them directly with the county clerk through a secure digital portal. Oliver packed his briefcase, shook my hand, with a firm, silent nod of profound professional respect, and walked out of the room to coordinate the ongoing prosecution with the federal agents. Rachel and I were left completely alone in the quiet office suite. She stood up from the table and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the busy city streets below. The morning rush hour was in full swing. Thousands of people were driving to work and buying coffee, completely unaware of the massive life-altering war we had just finished fighting in the shadows. I walked over and stood quietly beside her. I did not offer any empty platitudes or tell her that everything was going to magically be perfect tomorrow. She had been through a brutal, deeply traumatic experience, and true healing would require time and patience and professional support. I simply placed my hand gently on her shoulder, offering the silent, steady support of a father who would burn the world down to keep her safe. Rachel turned her head and looked up at me. For her entire life, she had viewed me as a quiet, gentle man who liked to read historical biographies on the front porch and build wooden birdhouses in the backyard. She had always known I was a retired military veteran, but she had never truly understood the reality of what I had done during my overseas deployments. I had intentionally shielded her from the dark, violent nature of my past. But as she looked into my eyes, now standing in the bright sunlight of the district attorney office, the illusion of the soft, fragile grandfather was completely gone. She had watched me bypass electronic security locks in seconds. She had seen me effortlessly dismantle 2 armed mercenaries in a dark motel room. She had listened to me coordinate a massive federal takedown with the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned combat commander. The immediate danger had passed, and the legal separation from Trent was finally secure. She saw the terrifying lengths I was willing to go to protect her and her son. She finally saw the warrior who had been hiding in plain sight her entire life. Rachel did not look afraid. She did not look intimidated or repulsed by the darkness I had unleashed to save her life. A soft, profound smile slowly spread across her tired face. She wrapped her arms tightly around my neck and buried her face in my shoulder. She whispered a quiet, trembling thank you into my jacket. In that single fleeting moment, the heavy, suffocating burden of the past 48 hours lifted completely from my chest. I hugged my daughter back, resting my chin on the top of her head. The immediate physical threat of Trent Lawson was entirely neutralized, and the legal paperwork was perfectly secured, but the emotional reality of our new life was just beginning to set in. We walked out of the federal courthouse together, stepping out into the bright, warm afternoon sun, ready to go pick up my grandson and finally take him home. The drive back to the suburban house was quiet. The heavy, oppressive tension that had choked the air inside my truck for the past week was finally gone. Rachel sat in the passenger seat watching the trees blur past the window. Little Leo was asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional whiplash of moving between safe houses and fortified estates. I pulled into the driveway of the home I had built. The front lawn was green and freshly cut. The house looked exactly as it always had, but the invisible, lingering ghost of Trent and his cruelty still stained the edges of my daughter's mind. I could see it in the way she hesitated before putting the key into the front door. She took a slow, trembling breath, expecting to walk into a battlefield. I placed my hand gently on the middle of her back. I told her the war was over, and it was time to just be home. We walked inside. The house was spotless and completely silent. But a home is not just a building with a secure deed and locked doors. A home is a living, breathing thing, and this one had been deeply wounded. Over the next few weeks, I watched Rachel flinch every time a door closed a little too loudly. I watched Leo sit quietly in the corner of the living room, pushing his toy cars around without making a single sound. The trauma of the past year weighed heavily on both of them. They had survived the explosive climax of the nightmare, but the silent echoes of the abuse were still holding them hostage. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had spent the last several days operating as a cold, calculated military asset. I had completely dismantled a man and destroyed his entire empire. But that tactical mindset was completely useless here. You cannot order a fractured spirit to heal. You cannot interrogate away a broken heart. I needed to completely power down the operator and return to being the soft, loving father and grandfather they desperately needed. True strength is not just the ability to break a dangerous man in half. True strength is having the absolute capacity to be gentle when the violence is finally done. I started in the kitchen. I did not ask Rachel to help me or expect her to manage the household. I woke up early every single morning and brewed fresh coffee. I cooked the exact meals I used to make for her when she was a little girl. I filled the house with the rich, comforting smells of roasted chicken and warm-baked bread. I wanted to completely overwrite the bitter memory of that suffocating dinner where Trent had tried to steal our lives. I washed the dishes and folded the laundry and made sure the only thing Rachel had to worry about was resting. I showed her through quiet, steady actions that she was safe and protected and profoundly loved. But little Leo needed something different. He needed a sanctuary of his own. He needed to see that the hands of his grandfather could build things instead of just tearing them down. I drove my truck down to the local hardware store. I bought stacks of premium cedar lumber and boxes of galvanized nails. I bought a brand new set of child-sized tools. I carried the heavy wood into the backyard and chose the large, sturdy oak tree near the fence line. I spent the next 4 days measuring and cutting and building. I was not constructing a fortified bunker. I was building a castle for a 5-year-old boy. At first, Leo just watched me from the back porch. He sat on the wooden steps with his chin resting in his hands, watching the sawdust fly into the air. I did not pressure him or tell him to come help. I just whistled an old tune and hammered the nails into the strong oak branches. On the second afternoon, he slowly walked down the grass and stood a few feet away. By the third day, he was standing right beside me, handing me the wooden planks and proudly wearing a yellow plastic hard hat. I showed him how to hold the hammer. I guided his small hands as he drove the nails into the fresh cedar. We built a sturdy rope ladder and a trapdoor. We painted the walls a bright, cheerful blue. When we finally finished the treehouse, I sat on the grass and watched him climb up the rope ladder with a massive, genuine smile on his face. He leaned out the wooden window and shouted down to me, declaring that he was the king of the entire backyard. I laughed and saluted him. Rachel walked out onto the patio, holding a mug of coffee. She looked at her son laughing in the bright afternoon sun, and then she looked at me. The dark, exhausted shadows, her eyes were finally beginning to fade. The color was returning to her cheeks. She was healing. The quiet, steady routine of love and safety was doing what no legal document could ever achieve. That evening, after Leo was tucked safely into his bed, Rachel walked into my private study. I was sitting in my old leather chair, reading a book under the warm light of a desk lamp. The study was peaceful and quiet. Rachel walked over to the heavy wooden desk. Resting right next to my reading glasses was the old, modified, encrypted pager. I had taken it out of the winter coat lining and left it on the polished wood. Rachel reached out and gently picked up the small black device. She looked at the blank green screen for a long time. This was the exact device she had frantically messaged in the absolute darkest moment of her life. This was the lifeline that had summoned a monster out of the shadows to save her. She ran her thumb over the worn plastic casing. I watched her carefully, wondering if the sight of the pager would trigger a painful memory of Trent and his raised fist. But she did not flinch. She did not cry. A soft, warm smile slowly spread across her face. She looked up from the device and met my eyes. She knew with absolute certainty that she would never need to type those desperate numbers into a keypad ever again. Trent was gone forever, and the men who had threatened her were locked in cages. But holding that pager, she felt the profound, undeniable weight of the protection it represented. She knew that no matter how old I got, or how quiet I seemed, I would always be the impenetrable shield standing between her and the darkness. She gently placed the pager back on the wooden desk exactly where she found it. She kissed the top of my head and whispered good night. She walked out of the study, leaving the door slightly open. Her spirit was finally stitched back together, and the fractured pieces of our family were whole once more. For the first time since the nightmare began, the house felt like a home again. The seasons changed with a slow, quiet grace, completely erasing the chaotic violence of that long weekend. Winter melted into a bright, warm spring, and the heavy, suffocating tension that once filled the air of my home was entirely replaced by the soft sounds of a normal life. It is a strange, profound thing to transition from an active combat mindset back into the gentle rhythm of a suburban grandfather. You learn to stop listening for the sound of shattering wood and start listening for the laughter of a 5-year-old boy running across the fresh-cut grass. But underneath that beautiful domestic peace, there is always a lingering, silent question. Can true absolute safety ever really be maintained once you have unearthed such profound darkness hiding inside your own family? The federal justice system answered that question for me exactly 8 months later. I sat in the very back row of the federal courthouse and watched the final sentencing hearing of the man who had bruised my daughter and threatened my grandson. Trent Lawson was brought into the courtroom wearing a shapeless, heavy orange jumpsuit. His expensive tailored suits and his arrogant corporate swagger were gone forever. He looked older, weaker, and completely hollowed out by the sheer crushing weight of his reality. The judge did not show him a single ounce of mercy. Because we had provided the court with undeniable audio evidence of him soliciting violent mercenaries to abduct a child, the judge handed down a maximum sentence. Trent was condemned to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He would spend the next 2 decades locked inside a cold concrete cage, entirely forgotten by the wealthy professional network he had tried so desperately to impress. He did not look back at me as the heavy steel doors closed behind him. The corrupt physician who had signed those fraudulent medical documents met a similarly devastating fate. Dr. Elliot Sterling was permanently stripped of his medical license in absolute public disgrace. His entire clinic was dismantled by federal auditors, and he was sentenced to a decade behind bars for his role in the medical conspiracy. The men who thought they could casually erase my existence and steal my life savings were now nothing more than federal inmate numbers. The shadow syndicate that Trent had owed $500,000 to never came knocking on our door. Oliver had secured our assets so flawlessly behind impenetrable legal trusts that my family effectively did not exist on any financial radar. The threat was not just neutralized. It was completely, utterly eradicated from the face of the earth, with the toxic, dark shadow of her abuser permanently removed. My daughter began to thrive in ways that brought tears to my eyes. Rachel did not just survive the trauma. She completely conquered it. She threw herself into her graphic design career with a fierce, renewed passion. Without a manipulative narcissist constantly whispering poison into her ear and sabotaging her confidence, her professional talent exploded. She launched her own independent design agency from the renovated sunroom at the back of my house. I watched her sit at her drafting table bathed in the warm afternoon light, negotiating massive contracts with a calm, unbreakable authority. The pale, terrified woman who had cowered on the cold linoleum floor of the kitchen was completely gone. In her place stood a powerful, fiercely independent mother who knew exactly what she was worth. She never looked over her shoulder anymore. She walked through the world with her head held high, knowing that she had walked through absolute hell and emerged completely victorious. And then there was little Leo. The most important mission objective of my entire life was ensuring that the poison of his father never infected his childhood. Children are incredibly resilient, but they absorb the energy of the adults around them. As the months passed and the house remained a sanctuary of absolute calm, Leo began to truly blossom. He forgot about the sudden midnight moves and the tense whispered arguments. His world became beautifully, incredibly small and safe. His biggest daily concern was whether we were having pancakes for breakfast, or if we had enough time to climb up into the blue cedar treehouse before it started to rain. He ran barefoot through the backyard, chasing fireflies in the evening, completely oblivious to the massive violent war that had been fought in the shadows just to secure his right to a happy, innocent childhood. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. I stepped out onto my front porch just as the early morning sun began to crack over the horizon. The neighborhood was perfectly still. The air was cool and crisp, smelling of fresh morning dew and wet pine needles. I held a chipped ceramic mug of hot black coffee in my calloused hands, letting the warmth seep into my bones. I sat down in the old wooden rocking chair facing the quiet suburban street, a few houses down. A neighbor stepped out in his bathrobe to pick up the morning newspaper. He raised a hand and gave me a friendly, casual wave. I smiled a soft, genuine smile and waved back. To that neighbor and to the rest of the world, walking their dogs and driving to the grocery store, I am exactly what I appear to be. I am just a simple, quiet retiree, spending his golden years tending to his garden and spoiling his grandson. They see an old man who moves a little slower these days, a man who enjoys the simple, profound peace of a quiet morning. They do not know about the heavy encrypted military pager resting safely in the bottom drawer of my desk. They do not know about the complex tactical bypasses or the brutal silent submissions executed in dark motel rooms. They do not know about the absolute chilling darkness I had to willingly step back into so that my daughter could finally sleep through the night. And they will never have to know. I took a slow, deep sip of the bitter black coffee. From the backyard, I could hear the back door swing open, followed by the rapid, joyful thumping of small shoes running across the wooden deck. Leo was awake and ready to start a brand new day of building wooden birdhouses and exploring the garden. Rachel called out from the kitchen, telling him not to run too fast in his socks. Her voice was light and musical and completely free of fear. I leaned back in the heavy wooden rocking chair and closed my eyes, letting the warm morning sunlight wash over my face. I had spent 2 decades hunting the worst monsters on the planet in the most unforgiving corners of the globe. I had carried the heavy, violent weight of that life so that normal, decent people could sleep in peace. But the greatest, most important mission I had ever undertaken was not ordered by a commanding officer or stamped with a classified seal. It was triggered by a simple sequence of numbers sent by a terrified mother in the middle of the night. The war had come directly to my front door, and I had met it with absolute overwhelming force. I had broken the men who tried to break my family. I had secured our perimeter and rebuilt our sanctuary from the ground up. The darkness had been permanently pushed back into the shadows where it belonged. I am an old man content in his silence, watching the beautiful ordinary world wake up around me. The perimeter is perfectly secure. The mission is officially accomplished, and I will stand the silent watch for the rest of my days to ensure that my family never has to be afraid ever